Hi everybody, welcome to another episode of the Future Tech podcast series. It's me, Charlie Sell, board director at Major Group, where I get a chance to speak to technology leaders, people who are just passionate about STEM, promoting STEM careers to young people, as we know that this podcast is aimed at our many young STEM listeners. Sponsored by the STEM Ambassador Association, and always open and looking for new guests. So I am really, really pleased to have Naomi Johnson with me today. Naomi is a wonderful person when we hear her story. She is the diversity and inclusion leader, a strategy leader, someone who's built a career in promoting neurodiversity. And as she's told me, and as we can see on some of the awards, she's been voted one of the UK's #1 neurodiverse advocates. So we are very, very lucky to have her on the podcast today. And Naomi has a background working for, a variety of businesses, currently working for a global technology company. So has seen it all. Naomi, welcome to the podcast.
Thank you. Hi, Charlie. It's really good to be here. Thank you very much. Yes, tech companies all the way through, but varying different roles.
Yeah, and let's jump straight into that. So tell us a bit about your career, your story. How did you get into tech?
So I started out in tech a long time ago. I have had a very interestingly varied career. I started out actually not in tech at all. I started out all the way back, leaving school at 16. I didn't go into, I did try to do A-levels. I tried to do A-levels twice, but didn't succeed. And the reason for that becomes obvious a bit later in my life. But what I did end up doing was I ended up taking people pony trekking in the Brecon Beacons. I ended up teaching scuba diving in Egypt. I ended up training as a nanny, hat, uniform and gloves, full-on outfit. I lived in Egypt, I lived in New York. And then when I came back, I got asked to go and join a friend of mine who was working in tech at the time. And he asked me if I wanted a job in tech because he knew I'd been tinkering around with computers since I was sort of 8, 9, 10 years old. And he said, come and work with me. And I said, okay, then went and had the interview. And I ended up working at the British Museum Company as my first job. So I ended up working on the till systems back then, on the back-end database systems. And I started out there. And within the first week, Darren, who is still a good friend to this day, went on holiday and left me in charge of everything, which when there's only 2 of us and I'd only just seen a server for the first time was an interesting leap of faith. So I went and I worked there. I worked there for 3.5 years. I then moved on and I worked for another retail business. I moved into a company working investment banking and into the stock exchange side of things. I moved over to a music media company who had the likes of Alice Cooper on their books. I then shifted again over to a law firm and eventually ended up at a service provider. The service provider I worked for, I started out there as third line lead, handling merger customers because of my disparate tech background. I had so many different pieces to what I had done from tech side of things. I'd done every version of Exchange, Microsoft software known to man. I'd done all the antivirus softwares in different roles. And so what I ended up doing was I ended up going in to help with all the customers coming into the business who all had different softwares, who hadn't been signed into the company as a new customer, but had come through as a merger. So I worked doing that for a few years. And then I was asked to move into head of internal IT. Again, due to the merger piece, I had a COO who had a lot of faith in me and said, I know you can fix this, please help me. And so off I went and did that. And again, we're all friends still. My C-levels and I still meet up once a year for food and drinks together. And then once I'd been doing all of that, and whilst I was working there, I went through some diagnostics because it was around the time I'd had my children, and I had a child who was going through autism diagnostics. And when I'd been pregnant with him, I'd watched a TV show about women who are autistic, and a sort of penny dropped, and I kind of went, oh, that's interesting. That sounds familiar. And so what ended up happening was I ended up going through my diagnostics myself. I then was diagnosed as autistic. I was diagnosed as ADHD later on. And I started talking about it. So the recruiters at the time up in Leeds asked me to come and do a talk for them. And it was my first foray into all of these things. And those who have got ADHD will recognize that the slides for that one, I knew about them 3 months in advance. I did them at 5 a.m. before a 7 a.m. breakfast presentation. That is a neurodiversity special of the highest order that a lot of us will recognise if we're neurodivergent, is the task avoidance that goes with something like that. You know you can do it, but taking that first step is always interestingly challenging. And from there, I got asked to do that fairly regularly. I was made redundant during COVID, or just before COVID, in fact. Let's think about this timelines-wise. I got made redundant at the middle of February, which was meant to be a good thing. I'd made that choice that said, actually, yes, I'm going to have 6 months off. I'm going to have some time to myself for the first time in a fairly long career. I'm going to just have a bit of a breather. I'm going to do a bit more neurodiversity work because it's something I'm passionate about because of my children. And I was going to raise a dog who is enormous, who at the time was a puppy. And then what actually happened was a week and a half later, the puppy arrived a week later, and a week and a half later, the COVID lockdown started. So my timing, as always, was impeccable. And so that 6 months, I didn't do any of the things I set out to do. I didn't end up doing what I wanted. I ended up looking after children who were homeschooling. I ended up having a giant teething land shark, as I would refer to at the time. And then after all of that, I applied for a role, a tech role again that summer, and I got it at a global. And then a year on, I had spent a year where I'd gone in as co-director for neurodiversity as well. So I'd actually joined our, what we call it, the ERG, so employee resource groups. And I joined the disability ERG, and I joined in with that. And I had become co-director for neurodiversity, and we'd done loads of different events. And my co-director and I did lots and lots of things, and it was amazing. And I started supporting parents and of children who are neurodivergent and adults within the business. And then on the back of that, I was asked to apply for a new role. And I had a fairly serious think about it because obviously changing career path 20 years into a career is an interesting choice to make at times. And I decided to go for it. I decided actually the skill set I was about to learn would lean into my tech career as well if I wanted to go to it again. Because what I was being asked to do was look at disability inclusion and strategy across 10 EU countries for the business I was working for. And obviously that lent into the compliance work I'd done, working varying different customers from a service provider perspective. It did a lot of leaning into legislation and understanding what was going on out there from that side. And so I kind of went, yes, okay, then 3-year strategy, 10 European countries, 500,000 people, I can do this. So I made a jump and I went into disability inclusion. And so I've been in that now for 2 years, which has been an amazing journey. I'm lucky I'm hyperlexic, which is the opposite of dyslexic. So I pull information really quickly. And so actually my neurodivergent strengths mean that moving into a new career like that is something I thrive on as opposed to find massively challenging, quite frankly, because it's new and exciting, which the ADHD likes. And my hyperlexia means I pick the information quickly. So yeah, it's been an interesting journey. If you'd asked me at 16 where I was going to be, none of that would have been in the plan. If you'd asked me 3 years ago, none of that would have been in the plan. So yeah.
Wow, and as you said, I mean, when we first met and we discussed your background, what I just love is the openness of how there wasn't a fixed plan, was there? You because in fact you didn't know that you were probably ADHD or autistic when going through school, and that would have naturally had a knock on about your A levels, and hopefully today the world has changed a bit that these things get picked up a lot quicker now, but you've been able to make a success even with those challenges, and you found technology by coming across it. So I guess for me, one of the takeaways is that open-mindedness and ability to try different things was so important.
I think that's it. I think if you'd, I think when you're at school and you're 16, 17, 15, 16, 17, any of those ages, you feel like the decisions you are making for your GCSEs, the decisions you're making for your A levels are that final decision. That is going to map the rest of your career. And I mean, look at my career span, look at all the different spaces I've been into. Yes, there's been a similar thread with tech for a long time, but actually, I didn't really think about that when I was looking at GCSEs, when I was looking at A levels. If you'd asked me at 14, I wanted to be an archaeologist. At 15, I wanted to be a marine biologist. Um, and again, we're back to the ADHD switch up of what's interesting me at the time. I did languages at school. I actually did 5 languages at GCSEs. So, yeah.
Wow.
So I did ancient Greek, Latin, German, Spanish, and French, none of which I use to this day, past occasionally and once in a blue moon on holiday. But I think what I've learned is actually anything you do from a job perspective leans into any other career path you want to look at, because you're always learning, you're always growing, and you're learning skill sets in all sorts of roles that you don't even realize you're doing, whether it be leadership, whether it be communication styles, whether it be customer service. All of that leans into so many different things if you want to take a leap and go and do something else. It's a really interesting space. I mean,
Yeah.
I've got a daughter who's 8 and a son who's 10, and they're already trying to figure out what they want to be, and I'm sitting there going, it doesn't matter. Do things you enjoy, learn the things you want to learn, and you'll figure it out as you go along.
Yeah. Yeah, and I think that's just brilliant advice, and as you say, that can go throughout. That doesn't have to make life decisions at 15, 16, 17. You can, you need to have that open mindedness, and so looking at, we're so fortunate to have someone like yourself on the podcast that has chosen to actually invest much more of their time and pivot their career into really exploring neurodiversity and within the workplace, and how we can make the workplace a better place. What's how have you seen it change over the period of time, and where would you love to see businesses and companies go to really help become advocates for neurodiversity in the workplace?
I think the first piece is to make sure that they're recognizing it's not just all about strengths at times. What you hear sometimes is that narrative that says, oh, everyone who's autistic has these superpowers. You start hearing this narrative, and actually it's not a very helpful narrative, because what you want people to recognize, like anything, all of us have strengths and challenges, I prefer to call them, not weaknesses. And therefore, what it happens with neurodiversity is, whereas with somebody neurotypical, the wave is like this. With somebody who's neurodivergent, the wave is a lot higher and a lot lower. So the high points are a lot higher, the low points are lower than a standard sort of wave that you've got with people. And so when somebody is performing well, those high points are those strengths, like my hyperlexia, where, you can put me in a meeting and I'll have 3 screens running, I'll be picking information, I'll have the answer before anyone else has even read the page. But I can only do that when my challenges are supported. I can only do that when the meeting is run inclusively, or when people are not expecting me to have a meeting where I am looking straight at you at all times, because that's the social norm and how politeness works. Because actually, as an ADHDer, I am far better doing 12 things at once, because that's how I listen and I concentrate, because actually I'm doing a lot of other things. And I think that's the first step in some ways, is for people to recognize, it's not just about bringing people in for this, for these superpower conversations. It's also about the full journey through the company. It's not just about hiring. It's about the company itself. It's about actually what that journey looks like for somebody. Have they got equity in their life cycle within the business? Are their peers educated as well as their leaders? How is that education pushed through? And is it made up to date at times? Because actually the world of neurodiversity especially moves on very, very quickly. I worked with Genius Within at times, Nancy Doyle. She is the head researcher along with Elmuth for Birkbeck University, for instance. We're lucky in the UK that actually we are fairly far forward in our conversations around neurodivergency and neurodiversity at work. But we still need to make sure that we are not expecting people to fit in the box that says this is what work looks like, but actually start expanding that. If somebody wants to work on a beanbag sitting on the floor, and we saw it in the 2000s with the new offices and things, but that was because it was trendy. There's actually a big difference. That's actually, from neurodiversity perspective, is awesome. You know, you'll find I sit on a sofa one minute, I sit at a desk the next, I'm walking up and down talking, I'm all over the place, and I have my dogs with me. A workplace needs to be inclusive and accepting of people and all of their differences. And I think that's one of the big challenges at the moment, is still working towards that.
Yeah. Yeah, and I remember you also, you know, when we were speaking the other day, and I think you were telling me it was also one of the other biggest challenges, also societal challenges, because not every culture will recognise, or people feel comfortable about being able to be identified. Talk a bit about that, because I was fascinated, and it really struck a chord for me.
So that's the intersectionality piece, and it's something I talk about a huge amount, is especially within the disability world, especially within neurodivergency, what you find is a lot of the time companies and people in general only see their one specific thing. So they see, we're going to do a disability thing, we're going to do a women's STEM thing, we're going to do, but actually what you need to look at is how everything intersects. You know, what does somebody's cultural background or ethnicity or gender or any of these pieces, how it all interlinks together. For instance, with dyslexia, with sort of disabilities, with neurodiversity, what you find is, depending on the country you're from, or the religion you're from, or the culture you're from, it may be that it's something you don't disclose, because you're already sort of working on the principle, I'm already a person who is of a low minority background, or a non I've got COVID, everyone, so I'm not doing very well at getting all my words out today. Welcome to me being neurodivergent. So it's all right. So trying to make sure that you actually feel safe to be accepted, not only for all of the other groups you sit in, as well as a neurodivergency group, it starts adding on those layers. And that's when it becomes more challenging for people to feel safe to say who they are. Because actually, if they come from a background where disability is still not something that's discussed, or mental health is something that's not discussed at all, actually it becomes very much more difficult to get past the stigma. It's all very well and good in a workplace talking about it and saying it's fine to be who you are. But actually, unless we recognise those intersections, unless we start making sure that people feel safe and see themselves represented as well, that's actually such an important piece of all of this. You find, if you Google and if you look for neurodivergency advocates, if you look for disability advocates, there's still a higher prevalence, obviously, of white and male, or white and female, interestingly, from a neurodiversity perspective. Trying to actually get more people out there, trying to make sure we're seeing representation and we're recognising the challenges other people face, not just in their neurodiversity journey, or not just in their disability journey, but actually their whole journey across all of their relevant pieces, is incredibly important, because all of that impacts who you are as an individual, and impacts the equity you get and the support you get, and how you feel you can ask for support as well.
Yeah. Yeah, and as I say, when you talk to me about this, and it really, I just find it fascinating, because it is the combination of many different things. You can't just silo each different part of DNI, or even and many other things into silos. That intersect really resonated, and it. I think, you know, how you described it was brilliant. And so, moving on to the last part of the podcast, and hopefully, you know, there'll be some of our listeners out there that this has really resonated with, and you know, hopefully they're already aware of whether they're on a spectrum or something, and how they've learned techniques on how to deal with it. But what career advice can you give young people, you know, and we can tailor it to neurodiverse, or be more general, but to get that foot in the door, you know, what, from your experience and from the many interviews and senior positions you've led, what one or two bits of career advice would you give to our young people?
I think there's a couple of different pieces. There's the piece that says, find the thing that you enjoy. It's all very well and good having a career, but also find the thing that you enjoy doing, because going to work is more fun that way. It's part of the enjoyment of doing it. Yes, there's good days. Yes, there's bad days, always. But you will enjoy work a whole lot more if you actually really are passionate about the thing you're doing. The second one for me is leadership. Make sure you have a leadership who support you, who are growing you. Actually, part of our job as leaders is to make sure you're ready for the next job, is to actually give you the training, the coaching, the support, not just technically, but the soft skills as well. Because people sometimes forget all of those soft skills. Talking about how you communicate with each other, understanding how people work in workplaces, understanding leadership and EQ is something that your leaders should be helping you with. And I think that for me is a big thing. As I've gone through my life, I've realized what a great leader looks like versus a manager. And for me, those two things are very distinct and separate. And yes, you need managers and yes, you need leaders, but actually a combination of the two and somebody who looks after their team, supports and brings them to their next role is actually what you want to be having in your life. Because I have quite a few of those who are still mentors to me now. We're still friends now. And they are the ones that I value. You know, they're the ones that I remember. They're the ones who are there, still there for support now, even 10, 15 years later. So, yeah.
Yeah, what brilliant bits of advice, because leadership and following something that you enjoy, you know, I couldn't agree with you more, you know. So, well, Naomi, time has flown by as always, and it's been such an interesting conversation. And again, you mentioned when we were speaking the other day that you're quite happy for if this resonates with anyone through the podcast that there is a network, there's places people could go to or reach out and get that support.
Yeah, so there's a couple of different things you can do if you have a disability or if you have any neurodivergent conditions, because the two are not necessarily interchangeable. Some people will not consider themselves disabled with neurodivergency, some people will. So I use both words interchangeably in my version of things, but I recognise for others it may not be the same. So the Department of Work and Pensions have something called Access to Work. And if you have any of these conditions, whether you consider yourself disabled or not, you can reach out to Access to Work and you can get support there for your conditions to make sure that the workplace is equitable for you. So that's one huge one from my perspective. It allows you to get neurodiversity coaching, for instance. It allows you to get the support you need on the softwares you need. So software for dyslexia, softwares to enable screen readers. So all of these things are available to you through that. So I would really suggest anyone who feels that actually that would help their journey, because some people aren't ready to disclose all the time. Some people aren't ready to say to work, I need this. This is a route to do that without having to face it head on. It's a route where you can go to Access to Work and they can support in that piece. So yeah, Access to Work, definitely neurodiversity coaching. There's a few different companies. I always will recommend Genius Within purely because they are so awesome. They work with Access to Work anyway. So yeah, and reach out to me. I mean, I'm very happy for people to reach out to me on LinkedIn, to have a conversation with me. If anyone needs anything, if anyone needs any support or anything, you know, just pointing in the right direction, feel free to ask. It's all good.
That's how wonderful and how kind of you. So, well, thank you, Naomi. That's been such an interesting story, and it's so great to have genuine, passionate experts like yourself on such important life situations and things like the neurodiversity. And so, for me, a massive thank you to you. Thank you for being on our podcast.
Thank you very much for having me, and apologies for losing my words somewhat today.
Absolutely not. And to our listeners, that's another episode of the Future Tech Podcast. It is shared with the STEM Ambassador Association across their many channels, along with on our website, majorgroup.com/podcast, and on our Spotify channel. So once more, a massive thank you to Naomi, and to everyone else. This is another episode of Future Tech. Thank you.